But welcome everybody. I'm Emily Lavin with Lavin Strategies. I'm a nonprofit management consultant. Some of you I know, a few of you are new to me. Um, a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording the presentation today. There is going to be plenty of time at the end for Q&A. During the presentation, we're going to use the chat. There are going to be times that I may stop and ask some questions. We can use the chat function. There's not a Q&A, so just use the chat function. We're a small group. So if you have a question, if there's something that you need me to clarify, I'm happy to pause for a minute, clarify that. Just put it in the chat or even just take yourself off mute and let me know, hey, I have a question about that. I would rather, though, we not get into specifics to your organization during the presentation. So if you have something that's a little more niche, if you'll just hold that question till the end. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you, everybody, for putting your name in the chat box here. I am going to go ahead and share. Hold on just a minute. I think I have to pull up my application. Okay.
Oop.
Here we go. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right. So today we are going to be talking about board governance essentials. I will say this presentation is sort of designed when we talk about board governance, more so for organizations that have staff. But I realize that some of the organizations today may be all volunteer organizations. So as we're talking about things, I'll try to point out where there might be differences between working boards and boards that are fully governing boards. A little bit about me. I'm a nonprofit management consultant specializing in board governance and strategic planning. I've been in the nonprofit sector approximately 20 years, most recently as a chief strategy officer for NeighborWorks Western Pennsylvania. Most of my experience prior to consulting was in the housing and community development, primarily in the resource development space, the strategy space, and the operations space. So one of the things that I have loved about consulting is getting to know different organizations outside of housing with different missions and connecting to those missions. I am trained through BoardSource, which is sort of the gold standard in nonprofit board governance. They have a wealth of resources, both paid resources as well as free resources. So I highly encourage everybody to check out BoardSource and everything that they have to offer. I'm located in Temple, but I serve nonprofits sort of all over the place. Many of my clients are located in Texas and in Central Texas particularly, but I do have several out-of-state clients and even nationwide federated organizations, for example, Family Promise National. And outside of my consulting practice, I am involved in causes around public education and homeless prevention and awareness primarily. I am on the board of Family Promise in Bell County and Temple Education Foundation currently. So in addition to my staff experience, I'm speaking also from the perspective of having served in board leadership positions. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the conversation today. We're talking about organizational governance, which is a system of policies, processes, and oversight mechanisms led by a board of directors that ensures a nonprofit fulfills its mission, acts ethically, and remains sustainable. Now, in a staffed organization, the board is primarily just a governing body. You're expected to volunteer, of course, and to care about the mission and support the mission, but the board of directors' primary job is to govern. If you're in an all-volunteer organization, you might have more of a working board or even a hybrid board that also has some responsibility for operations. But today we're going to be talking specifically about the governing function of a nonprofit board. So if you're a board member, you have 3 fiduciary board responsibilities. And when we talk about the word fiduciary, we often think of financial advisors, financial planners, but the word fiduciary essentially just means that you are the party responsible for another, ethically or morally or legally responsible for another party. And you need to manage that party's assets responsibly. So when you show up as a board member, you are employing three fiduciary responsibilities: duty of care, which basically means I'm going to show up, I'm going to participate actively in decision making, I'm going to come prepared, I will have read the materials, and I'm here to represent the organization and use my best judgment. Duty of loyalty, which is all about putting the interests of the organization above your own personal and professional interests. Not all the time, obviously, but when acting on behalf of the organization. And where this can get a little bit tricky is when you, like many of us, are wearing multiple hats. Sometimes you have to, as we'll talk about a little later in the training today, sometimes you have to sort of decide to remove that hat completely and remove yourself from some of the decisions where there may be a conflict of interest. Duty of obedience. This is about ensuring your organization obeys applicable laws. And this is sort of what you think about when you think about fiduciary responsibility, that you're obeying the laws, you're following your bylaws, and you're adhering to your stated mission and avoiding mission creep. So what does that mean in practice? The board has three primary roles. You're establishing strategic direction, ensuring sufficient resources, both financial and human, and you're providing fiduciary oversight: financial, legal, and ethical. A lot of times when people think about the role of the board and board governance, they're thinking about this fiduciary oversight, providing the oversight to the organization. But two other important roles are making sure that the organization has a roadmap, knows where it's going, has strategic priorities, adheres to its mission, has a mission, vision, and value statements, making sure that you're fundraising as a board member to ensure that you have sufficient resources and that your organization is supported. Conversely, in staffed organizations, the role of the chief executive or the executive director, and I'll use those terms interchangeably, essentially to just mean the highest ranking staff person, is to implement that strategy. So the board is setting the strategy, the chief executive is participating in that strategy, and then whatever the board decides, they're deciding from day to day, how are we implementing that strategy? What's our timeline? What are the roles? What are our programs? You're managing, the chief executive is managing operations and staff. So again, in a staffed organization, there's no management of the day-to-day operations by board members. Obviously, in a working board, that's a little bit different. You have to be involved in operations, but it's very important to sort of separate those two if you are sort of serving both functions. And then lastly, the role of the chief executive is to prepare and implement the organizational budget. So typically the executive director will prepare the budget, often in conjunction with the treasurer, or if the organization has a bookkeeper or an accountant, somebody that they work with, they might help with preparing the budget. And then the executive director is responsible for executing that budget and spending according to the board approved budget. So according to Board Source, the board has 10 basic responsibilities. And the majority of our workshop today is centered around these 10 basic responsibilities and what they each mean. So we'll go through each of these in depth. This is just an overview. The board is going to determine your mission and advocate. You're going to select, support, and evaluate the chief executive, plan effectively, monitor and strengthen programs and services. Again, as we've talked about, ensuring those financial resources, providing financial oversight. And importantly, the board's role is to build a competent board. The executive director is not necessarily responsible for handpicking all of the board members. The board has to develop processes to onboard new board members, recruit them, to decide what skills you need, and we'll talk about that kind of in depth. Ensuring that legal and ethical integrity, and lastly, to enhance the organization's public standing. You're there, you're always representing the organization, you're being an ambassador for the organization. So this is a really important role for the board of directors. All right, so just to frame it out, sort of the basics of being a well-functioning board: mission-focused, a diverse and representative board with multiple perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences, comprised of individuals with relevant skills, knowledge, and connections, right? You want to have the right people who actually know how to run a board, who have a connection to your mission, who have a connection to the community, who can open doors for you. Reliably gives of their time, talent, and treasure. We'll unpack that a little bit later, but we call those the 3 T's: showing up, giving of your gifts, and giving financially to the organization, and employing established practices in governance. So the first of those responsibilities is determining mission and purposes and advocating for them. And if you're just coming in, if you can go ahead and just put your name, the organization you're with, and your role within that organization in the chat. There we go. So mission versus purpose. I want to touch on this for a minute. You may have heard this. I think I mentioned this in the Mission Ready session as well, if you attended that. But your purpose is the reason you exist. And I always use Family Promise of Bell County as my example because it is so unique to connect to that purpose. The purpose is that there are homeless families in Bell County and they need our help. That's the reason why we exist. Your mission is a unique approach to a common purpose. It's the how, the why, how you do the work that you do. And the reason that it's important to differentiate the two is that a number of organizations can exist for the same purpose, right? That's why in our communities, there's food insecurity and there are multiple food pantries, right? But your approach to that purpose is going to be unique. For example, at Family Promise, there's a very specific program that families follow in which they have to do the work, get a job, get transportation, ensure their kids are enrolled in school, and they have to follow that in order to graduate from the program. It's very different than a model that might be housing first, we shelter you for a night, we don't provide supportive services. Those organizations, 2 organizations may have the exact same purpose, but very different missions, very different ways that they achieve that purpose. Board source, we're really going to focus on these 2 today, but this is important as we talk about board governance and board leadership. Board source has 4 principles of what they call purpose-driven leadership, really putting that focus on the purpose rather than the mission, purpose before the organization. And that's very related to the next principle, respect for the ecosystem, which acknowledges that an organization's actions can positively or negatively impact its ecosystem. So a good example of that, in a neighboring community, there is an existing food pantry that served the community for years and years. A much larger food bank is coming into the community and filling some of those needs that this organization that has existed for 60 years has already been filling in the community. So now we have this ecosystem that's expanding and organizations that are impacting one another, and missions may need to shift, programs may need to shift to accommodate that. So part of purpose-driven board leadership and employing good governance is understanding that the reason we exist is to serve this purpose and not to do the things we've always done the way that we've always done them. And that's how board members can show really strong leadership, by being able to pivot and respect that purpose and the ecosystem. The two other principles are equity mindset, or a commitment to advancing equitable outcomes, questioning status quo, and dismantling barriers created by past organizational decisions. So if you have an older organization, right, a more mature organization, maybe you haven't always done things the right way, but your board can be committed to changing that. You don't have to do the things the way you've always done them. And then lastly, authorize voice and power. Organizational power has to be informed by those who are impacted. That's that lived experience. If you don't have a way as a board of understanding the community that you serve and their unique needs, and they're not represented on your board or in an advisory group, then they don't really have power. So it's very important to consider who is on your board, and how that impacts the decisions that your board makes. Mission, vision, and values. Obviously, you can't fulfill that first piece of a board's responsibilities of implementing your mission and advocating for your mission if you haven't done a good job of setting your mission, vision, and values. And you may come into an organization that's an older organization, they already have a mission, they already have a vision, and maybe it's great. We'll talk about this, but boards go through strategic planning usually every few years and may tweak that mission or even change it completely, again, based on what's going on in the ecosystem, how needs are evolving. But to give you a broad overview, your vision, I always start with a vision, is the big picture of what you want to achieve, right? It describes that future state in which your goals have been achieved. So we don't want any child in our county to go hungry, for example. I'm using a lot of food insecurity examples. I'll switch to a different cause in a minute. Um, but so that's your vision. It's as if the work has already been done. Then your mission is going to describe why, who, how, what you aspire to accomplish. It's how you do the work. And then your values are the ethical guidelines and standards that direct all action. Often you'll see, integrity, respect, stewardship, generosity. And importantly, those values should guide internal and external decisions. So it's not just how you show up for the community or how you show up for your clients or the population you serve, but how you show up internally in board meetings, in the decisions, in the governing decisions that you make. We've talked about this a little bit, the key components of a mission statement, so I won't go into this in depth, but it is important that board members know, understand the mission, and can repeat it. And then a few examples of organizations that I think have really strong missions. The Boys and Girls Club in particular, I love because it's to enable all young people, especially those who need us most, to reach their full potential as productive, caring, responsible citizens. And I feel like just if you know the Boys and Girls Club, you know who it is that need us most. You don't have to spell it out, but it still hits all those components of a good mission statement, the who, the how, the what. The second piece of that first role is the advocacy piece. So how, as a board member, can you show up and advocate your cause? Legislatively, of course, at the state, the local, the national level. Um, this is a picture of leaders from the NeighborWorks Network, which I've been really involved in DC. These are all Texas leaders. Ambassadorship, beyond legislative advocacy, representing the organization at public events, being able to speak publicly, and at a more in an informal capacity, just being able to talk to your friends and neighbors and other leaders in your community about the organization, a willingness to amplify the message of your organization through your social media presence. Um, and all board members should know and practice the organization's case statement or elevator pitch, right? Like, what's our mission? What do we do? Why do we exist? You should be able to succinctly, as a board member, describe your organization to those who may be interested. The next two responsibilities I've kind of grouped together. One of the 10 roles is to select, support, and evaluate the chief executive or executive director. So uh, in a typical nonprofit, your structure is always your board is the highest level of authority. The only person that they supervise, that your board of directors supervises in the entire organization, is the executive director or chief executive. They report directly to the board. But in a healthy organization, it's not like I'm your boss, right? The board of directors isn't necessarily the boss. The executive director and the board of directors govern in partnership. It's a shared leadership model. And then the executive director is managing the day to day, hiring the other staff, etc. But it is the board's responsibility to hire and support and evaluate that chief executive. This is just a quote about a constructive board and executive partnership. Basically, just saying, these are interdependent positions. They rely on one another, and they have to see one another as a strategic asset. The role of selecting, supporting, and evaluate the chief executive involves a few components: leading a thorough, fair, and transparent selection process, establishing a competitive compensation, their salary, and reevaluating that regularly, typically in conjunction with their performance review, providing that annual performance evaluation, um, delegating authority to the executive director and avoiding that micromanagement. Just remembering that the executive director is the person who's there day to day, managing staff, implementing the mission and the budget, and the board needs to delegate them authority versus speaking directly to staff or going around them in any way. Ensuring a succession plan is in place for the planned or unplanned departure of their CEO. Those of you who are in Bell County probably know that at Family Promise, our executive director unexpectedly departed. He gave us a lot of notice, but we were not really prepared. We didn't have a strong succession plan in place, um, and have had to pivot successfully, I think. Um, but having that plan ensures that you know what's going to happen. If your CEO gets offered the job opportunity of a lifetime tomorrow, how are you going to adjust? Do you need to have an interim executive director? Do we have all of the processes in place that are memorialized? Do we know what they do? Do we have the passwords? Like, what does that look like? Make sure that you have, you know what's going to happen once that CEO leaves. And establishing clear roles and expectations for the executive director and reevaluate these annually. So, all of that said, clearly this slide describes a more mature organization with a comprehensive staffing model. If you're in an organization that is all volunteer or has limited staff, this looks a little bit different. But if you have an executive director, or when you decide it is time to have an executive director, all of these things apply, right? Even if that executive director, oftentimes you'll see this where the founder wants to be the executive director, or the founding board, or one of the founding board members does, they still have to be hired through a fair and transparent selection process. The board has to vote for that founder, or that founding board member to become the executive director. And then they no longer will have voting privileges as a board member because they are staff, regardless of whether or not they're compensated. You need to treat them as an executive director, delegate authority to them, separate the roles of the board and the staff, and establish those clear roles and expectations. And again, even if they're uncompensated, provide that annual performance evaluation so that the executive director knows how they are doing. I just have this slide. This is actually from my Mission Ready no, webinar a few weeks ago, just kind of reinforcing what I just said. that if the founder is serving as the chief executive, um, they can't vote, they don't maintain voting privileges, they report to the board, and they move into a position where they're managing operations and hiring staff. Effective executive evaluation. So, this is something that even very seasoned organizations struggle with. Um, I talk to organizations all the time that tell me, oh, the last time we evaluated our executive director was 3 years ago, right? Or, oh, we have an evaluation, but we just meet once a year and talk about how things are going. And that's not an effective executive evaluation process. You really want to use a structured process. It's typically led by the board chair. There are a number of resources out there, both paid and unpaid, that can help you design a structured process. Board Source has a paid tool called the Assessment of the Chief Executive, or the ACE. But there are also a number of templates that you can find online for evaluating your executive director. You want to include the full board, even if it's led by the chair. You really want to include the full board in the evaluation process. Some organizations even use a 360-degree feedback, which means that every board member and sometimes even staff members have the opportunity to provide feedback and in a survey format for the executive director. I feel like that can be a little much just because not every board member has the same level of interaction with the executive director. But I do think it's always appropriate for the board chair to fill out the evaluation and send it to the full board for review, to talk about it at a board meeting, and to get feedback from the rest of the board before sitting down with the executive director, and to also allow them to evaluate themselves. So they're using the same form you are, they're evaluating themselves and saying, okay, then you can compare their how they ranked themselves to how you rank them. And it allows you to evaluate against the job description and establish annual goals for the executive director. Again, even if your executive director is uncompensated, they should have that evaluation and they should have annual goals, which they're responsible for implementing. And then you should connect that evaluation, once you have the budget to do so, to compensation, and give raises accordingly. Next on our list, and I'm going to pause for just a second to make sure we didn't have any questions in the Q&A, or in the chat, rather.
Nothing yet.
Nothing yet. All right. Um, the
Emily,
Yes,
will we get a copy of this?
yes. So
Okay,
this will be
perfect.
available on the Rock Rose website as a recording, and it will also have the slides available as well by
Great.
themselves.
Okay, thanks.
So the next one, ensuring effective planning. Why plan? This is actually, I facilitated a retreat for Belton Education Foundation yesterday, and this is from that retreat. To be proactive rather than reactive. So you really want to use your plan, your strategic plan, not just as this rigid document that's, I'm going to do this at this timeline, but to develop a decision-making framework, right? When you have your strategies and you have your goals, then you can decide when new opportunities arise, whether that fits within your strategic plan or not. So it's designed to be flexible. You want to build that sense of shared responsibility among your board and your staff. You want to increase operational efficiency among leadership. So if you have a plan, again, you have that roadmap. You're aligning the organization's functional activities, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis to achieve your set goals. And you're managing those expectations and bolstering that trust between board and staff. So the board's role in strategic planning, I'm not going to read all of these, but you're establishing that vision, you're participating, you're providing your insight, your guidance at the governance level. Boards have to approve the strategic plan. Ideally, your strategic planning process involves both your executive staff or any other high-level staff. Some organizations may have a chief development officer, chief operating officer, who should also, or director of development, who should be participating in that strategic planning process. It's going to involve executive level staff. It's going to involve board members working together to set those goals, but then the board has to approve it. It's not your organization's strategic plan. It's not your roadmap until the board has voted on it and it's been approved by the board. So you're ensuring then once it's been approved, you're using that to guide your decision-making process going forward and your monitoring process toward those strategic goals by reviewing your performance measures, your outcomes, your initiatives. We'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about how we can monitor that progress and evaluate programs. And then you're supporting the implementation. Board members are supporting the implementation of a strategic plan by being ambassadors for that plan and helping secure the resources needed for success. They're being fundraisers, they're out in the community, they're making the connections. And the board needs to periodically assess and update the strategic plan in response to changing needs, opportunities, challenges. Typically, they say every 3 years. It used to be 5 years was the leading practice. Leading practice now for strategic planning is every 3 years. Just because so much can change. I mean, we've all gone through in the last 15 years, economic recession, COVID, political unrest, all things change, right? So it's really important. I like to do 3-year vision and then action plan for 12 to 18 months. It's hard to see what you can do specifically beyond 12 to 18 months. So you can have that vision that's longer term, but your actions need to be a little more short term. So monitoring related, right? Once you've set that vision, how are you monitoring? The board's role is monitoring and strengthening programs and services. You're not administering the programs and services, right? Like that's the role of the staff, but you need to monitor. You need to know that you are fulfilling your mission in the community. So the board role in monitoring and evaluation is to, regularly review impact dashboards with program outputs and outcomes. Now, what's the difference between an output and an outcome? An output is usually, hey, we've served this many people this month. We provided this many meals. We provided this many shelter nights. We placed these many children in foster care. Like, what are your outputs versus what are your outcomes? Your outcomes are going to be more long-term. So this is evaluating your programs over time. This is the difference in saying, hey, we provided this many shelter nights and this many families have stable housing as a result of our programming. When I worked for NeighborWorks Western Pennsylvania, which did homebuyer education for first-time homebuyers and connection to down payment assistance for low and moderate income individuals, we were tracking how many people did we provide housing counseling to every month, and how many people, as a result of that, actually purchase a home and maintain that home long-term. So outputs versus outcomes. And the board needs to have some sort of dashboard or way of understanding what the staff is doing on a regular basis. So good ways to do that are like having a mission moment in your board meeting where staff is coming in, sharing a great story about what's going on with a client or a family you've served. By having an actual dashboard that shows, hey, this is how many people we've served this month. This is what it looks like long term. This is what the demographic makeup of our client base is. Anything that might be relevant for the board to be able to see to make those informed decisions about programs and what's working and what's not. You want to, as a board, part of being a strong board governance is creating and supporting a culture of program evaluation by including strategic planning and budgeting conversations in your board meetings, right? So you're considering that impact and your programs when you're doing strategic planning when you're thinking about setting the annual budget or you're thinking about a program budget, right? How do you determine how your outputs and your program impact how much money you're going to allocate to that program this year, what you're going to expend, what you expect to bring in? If the need is increasing, do we need to bring in more funds to support that specific program, and how are we going to do that? So it's all interrelated, right? And then establishing another way that the board can support program evaluation is by establishing a program evaluation committee. That may not be necessary for all boards, but in some organizations, it might be helpful to have that, especially if you have board members who have a strong connection to the mission or who have lived or learned experience. So when you're monitoring programs as a board member, you want to ask really strategic questions, right? Like, what do these results tell us about our programs? Are we meeting the needs of the community? Where are the gaps? And again, this kind of goes back to the ecosystem conversation. You might identify gaps that your organization is not serving and no organization is serving. So maybe there's an opportunity to say, hey, should we consider doing something different with our programs to make sure that we're serving this unserved population? You want to ask more strategic questions like, how do we communicate the impact of our programs to stakeholders, to our funders, to our donors, to the community, to the media? What can we do to support our programs and our impact, right? So do we need to reallocate some of our resources, whether those are financial resources, right? Like maybe we have a lot of funding that's going to one particular program, but there's more need over here and we need to reallocate those. Maybe there are staff members or volunteers that need to be reallocated to a different program. So asking those strategic questions as a board member is a critical part of board governance because it helps staff to reallocate those resources. And this is just an example of an impact report from Family Promise National of the entire network. But this is the kind of thing that board members need to know to be able to make critical decisions about the organization's strategic direction. All right, so we're halfway through our responsibilities. Number 6 is to ensure adequate financial resources. Um, this is a hard one, right? This is the board's responsibility in fundraising. Some boards are stellar fundraisers. You look at, Temple Community Clinic and their huge ball that they have. There are some organizations that just do this really well, and some that struggle. And the reality is that not all board members are comfortable with fundraising. Or when they think about fundraising, they go immediately into this mindset of making the ask. So it's important to realize that the board's role in fundraising isn't just to make the ask. There's a lot of different ways that board members can support the organization in bringing in adequate financial resources, right? So board roles in fundraising, you have to approve the fundraising plan and support its implementation. So in a larger organization, your executive director might create a fundraising plan, take that to your resource development committee, they'll weigh in on it, and then that will go to the full board and say, yep, that's what we want to do. And we're using that fundraising plan to establish our annual budget and determine what our revenue goals are going to be. Now, the fundraising plan doesn't have to be super detailed. But it does need to at least have revenue goals in various categories for the coming years and an understanding of how you're going to meet those revenue goals, right? Are you going to have several events? Is it going to be, we're going through a giving campaign? What does it look like? Um, Another way, more board roles in fundraising, make a personally meaningful financial contribution. This should be in your board expectation, your board agreement. We'll talk about this a little further on, but anytime you're joining a board, there should be a board agreement that specifies what all the expectations of you as a board member are. And one of those things should be making a personally meaningful financial contribution. Now you'll see a lot of organizations, especially larger organizations or organizations that have more affluent board members. You'll see these give or get policies, right? Like all members need to give or get $1,000, meaning you're either going to contribute that yourself or you're going to leverage your networks to get that. I always advocate for this language in the board expectations of making a personally meaningful financial contribution because that says you don't you don't have the option of getting it. The expectation is that you are going to also give, but you're not going to necessarily have to give at the same level as another board member because what's meaningful for you may not be meaningful for somebody else, right? It's about what you can afford and also what the organization's value is to you. It's personal. Other roles in board roles in fundraising, serve as ambassadors for the organization. Again, talking up the organization to your friends, your networks, your colleagues, your neighbors. Leveraging corporate, small business, and other community connections. If you're a board member, you should have good connections in the community. And in theory, your board's going to be diverse. If you have a well-functioning board, it's not all going to be people with the exact same connections. You want to have folks who have, different networks within the community that they can leverage, whether it's small businesses, whether it's large businesses, corporations. Who do you know who can contribute? You want to make introductions to prospective donors. Again, not everybody's going to make the ask, but most people have a few people in their phone. I almost said your Rolodex that could be prospective donors, and they can make that introduction that the executive director or the board chair or the resource development committee chair, whoever is comfortable making that ask, can then go and make the ask directly. And lastly, you want to establish a high functioning resource development committee. We'll talk a little bit more about committees and the importance of committees, but it's really about while every board member needs to be involved in fundraising, having a committee that's exclusively focused on that. Because when you assign responsibility, things are more likely to happen. Responsibilities all need a place to live. So part of that and being a fiduciary is understanding your revenue mix, right? Because all board members are responsible for fundraising and for financial oversight. And so it's very important for those board members to understand what type of revenue the organization is bringing in. You want to have strong participation on your finance and your resource development committee, and that can include non-board members. Including non-board members on your committees is a great way to expand your capacity as a board without increasing your board size and to provide good on and off ramps for board members. So if somebody's been serving, a board member who's been serving on your finance committee for 5 years and now they're rolling off the board, they can continue to serve on the finance committee. They still are connected to the organization. It's also a good way if somebody is, on your development committee and raising a lot of funds for the organization, and maybe you want to tap them for a board position in the next cycle. You might want to use a comparative revenue report or some other tool that's looking at your goals, right? Like, here's what we said we wanted to bring in from our revenue this year in individual giving, in event-based support, and here's where we are to date. And looking at that, and here's where we were last year. Here's last year, here's where we are today, here was our goal. So something that you're looking at on a regular basis that helps the board track goals versus actuals when it comes to development. And then you want to ensure all of your board members understand the difference between restricted funds, grant funding, usually that's tied to programs and to specific outcomes, as well as unrestricted funds, which are typically operating support. That's not to say that some grant funds, that all grant funds are restricted. Some are for operating support, but you need to know what you can use for what, and board members need to understand that, in addition to what's on the, profit and loss and the balance sheet. Just very quickly, a note on the donor development cycle to emphasize that every board member has a role to play. So when you're talking about cultivating a new donor, you're identifying who that donor might be. Why do you think they would give to the organization? You're qualifying them. What are their values? Do they have the capacity to give? Are they connected to the mission in some way? Why do I think that they would be a good donor for the organization? The next step in that donor development process is cultivation. So you're sharing more about the mission, you're telling them about the organization, why you think it's a worthy cause, your connection to the mission. The next step is solicitation, making that ask, actually saying, hey, would you join me in supporting this organization at X amount? And then lastly, stewardship. You're thanking your donors, you're establishing recurring gifts, you're asking them to do so. Can you continue to give? And there are ways that board members can plug in at each stage of the donor development cycle. Most board members can identify, right? They know people in their networks who might be connected to the organization. They might understand their values and know whether or not they have the capacity to give, and they can share why the mission is important to them. They don't all have to get to that fourth piece of making the ask. That's something that can be handed off, as I said, to somebody else. And then everybody can also participate in stewardship. A simple way is simply by handing out um, note cards, right, at your board meeting and asking board members to write handwritten thank you notes to major event sponsors or to brand new donors, just to show your appreciation. This is something we do a lot at Temple Education Foundation, and I think our donors really appreciate that. A note on the ways you can give. Again, we call this the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. Time is really about duty of care. It's about showing up, attending the board meetings, attending the committee meetings, being prepared, being engaged, having reviewed the materials in advance, and being ready to ask questions, and also prioritizing event attendance. And I emphasize this because in some organizations, you'll see board members who make it to all the meetings, but when there's special events and fundraisers, volunteer events, they're largely absent. So you really want to encourage your board members to give of their time, including that attendance at all events. Talent. This is all about being of service, putting your skills and connections to use for the organizations. So potentially serving or leading on a committee that's aligned with your talents. If you're a CPA and you're the treasurer of the organization, or if you have that leadership, that nonprofit management experience, and it's easy for you to step into a board chair position, or you have very strong fundraising skills and you join the development committee. So being there, giving of your talents. And then treasure, again, making that personally meaningful financial contribution, but also leveraging your networks for financial and in-kind support. And every board member should reliably give of their time, talent, and treasure. But it's not for every board member going to say, hey, 33% time, 33.3% talent, and 33, everybody's going to show up a different way. There are going to be some board members who really knock it out of the park in this treasure category, and they are out there, they are leveraging their connections. The donation that they make to the organization is extremely generous, and you want these people on your board, right? They are helping fund the organization. The talent piece is so important to governance because without those individuals who have those skills and connections, you're not going to have effective committees. You're not going to have effective governance. And then that time, you want board members who can come to meetings, who can prioritize it. Some board members have a lot to offer in this category, right? You have those board members who are retired, or maybe they're at a place of career transition and they have a lot of time to give. And you want those as well. So making sure that your board has people that can give of all three, and understanding that not everybody has to give equally in each category. It's not going to be evenly weighted. All right. Protecting assets and providing financial oversight. Again, this is a tough one. This is one that some boards struggle with. Financial oversight, when you talk about that in board governance, we're talking about approving the annual operating budget, regularly reviewing your financial statements, reviewing your tax documents, the Form 990. If your organization requires an annual audit, reviewing that, making sure your organization has appropriate insurance like general liability, directors and officers insurance, so that your organization and your officers are not taking on that risk, and then ensuring that your organization has appropriate financial controls. Um, this is hard. Um, I will say I have served on a number of boards, and it's always, okay, here's the P&L, here's the balance sheet. I'll make a motion to approve the financials as presented. I'll second. All in favor. Okay, motion. Okay, financials approved. It's so important to present your financials in a way that board members can engage with them and ask those questions, because this is one of a board's primary responsibilities is to provide that financial oversight. And if board members don't have the tools necessary to provide that financial oversight, they're not going to be able to fulfill that duty. So a few best practices in financial oversight is establishing a strong finance committee chaired by the treasurer, developing tools and dashboards, again, that encourage that board engagement, that help people ask questions, create a culture of transparency. So when in doubt, share, right? I don't know if the board needs to see this, but let me share it anyway. The board needs to be familiar with the financials, so that they can do that job of providing financial oversight. And again, the board, a lot of times you don't see this, but the board actually has to approve your 990 filing and your audit. And that should be in your board minutes, that the board did review and that they did approve that. If you were to ever get audited by the IRS, they would look at your minutes to see whether or not the board reviewed and approved those. You want to create a financial management policy, or you might call it a financial risk policy, that basically lays out a number of things we'll look at in just a minute to protect yourself from financial risk, protect your organization from financial risk. And you want to ensure in staffed organizations that your executive director has the authority over that board approved budget, as well as some level of discretionary authority for spending outside the budget. Now, I have not had experience with this directly, but I have talked to organizations that were like, hey, my board is requiring a vote on purchasing toilet paper, and what the role of the board is approve that budget, and then the executive director can operate within that budget. If there is money allocated for that in the budget, the executive director should be able to use his or her best judgment to spend within that budget. You should also include some level of discretionary authority for spending outside that budget. Oftentimes, directors will be faced with a decision, something that wasn't accounted for, but that needs a quick response in terms of being able to spend. So having a financial management policy that allows the executive director to expend a certain amount above the board approved budget, without having to go to the board for approval. Now, your financial management policy, again, I'm not going to read this verbatim. You will have these slides, but it's essentially about providing internal controls and having that segregation of duties, right? So no person is going to have responsibility for all aspects of any single transaction. Somebody should be authorizing it. Somebody should be recording it. Somebody should be reconciling those transactions. You're working with your bookkeeper or your accountant or your treasurer or the executive director. Who is doing what? Who's signing the checks versus who's recording the checks and who's depositing the checks. You want to have strict procedures for how that cash is handled, for how reimbursements are handled, for how checks are deposited, how we're taking digital donations, right? How often are bank statements going to be reconciled? You want to have expense management and purchasing authority. Who can purchase what? Who can sign checks? Where are multiple signatures going to be required? You also want to have policies in place. And while this may or may not be in your financial management policy, you want to make sure you're protecting your donor data, any financial systems that you have. You want to make sure all of your accounts and passwords are, secure. So it is the board's responsibility. Again, this is governance. This sounds day to day, right? But it's the governance responsibility to make sure that your board has the policies and procedures necessary to protect the organization from any financial risk. And then compliance and regulatory procedures, again, making sure you're adhering to tax deadlines, to grant compliance, et cetera. Because as a board, it's your responsibility for maintaining compliance. All right, number 8, build a competent board. It is the board's responsibility to build the board. Um, Again, going back to that purpose-driven board leadership that we explored kind of at the beginning of this session, boards represent and govern organizations on behalf of the communities they serve. So who is on the board can drastically change the answers to how the board operates and what role the board plays. That's why board diversity is so, so important, um, and why representation is so important. So as you're building your board, and again, if you participate in the Mission 101 or the Mission Ready session, you've seen a couple of these slides, but as you build your board, you want to recruit individuals who have key skills and experiences, marketing and communications, resource development, people who have experience in finance, banking, accounting. One thing that I heard recently that I really loved was that your board treasurer doesn't necessarily have to be a CPA. Maybe it should be a 7th grade math teacher, right? Somebody who can explain finances to people, right? Who can teach the board. So you don't always have to look for those traditional going right to the CPA or right to the banking community. There might be other people you can bring onto your board that have that financial knowledge and who can, complement existing skill sets. Having legal representation, attorneys, people with nonprofit management experience. If you've talked to me before or been in any of my sessions, I always say this. I am almost always on every board I serve, the only person with nonprofit management experience. And so people are always looking to me, okay, Emily, what do I do in this situation? So don't discount that, bringing on folks who have nonprofit management experience, either as staff or who have served on multiple boards and who have a wealth of experience serving on boards. I'm working with several organizations right now who are starting their very first board, who are starting their founding board of directors, and we're looking for that specifically. Putting that in the description, we are looking for folks with board experience. You want to bring folks onto your board, again, going back to this authorized voice and power. Who's on the board can change how the board operates and what role the board plays. Folks with lived or learned experience. At Family Promise, we brought a former guest onto our board, a guest who has successfully graduated the program, who has stable housing, who's married, who has a good job. So somebody who can relate, who has this life experience, and they're bringing that representation to the board. And then human resources. This can be really helpful on any board of directors, particularly when you're hiring a new executive director, reevaluating your policies and procedures, your employee handbook, et cetera. As you're thinking about building the board, we've talked about this, you really want to bring in people that have connections from all across the community, from various sectors, whether that's small or large business, churches, education, obviously, philanthropy, anybody with political capital, and connections to other organizations within that nonprofit community, strong community connections. And where and how to find board members. Again, it is your role as a board to build the board. And that's really a part of governance, just sort of this cycle of renewal. So you're looking for volunteers, staff and board of similar organizations. You're asking your board and staff to tap into their networks. I say colleagues and acquaintances, right? Because you do want to be careful about bringing on too many close friends onto a board. You see this often, I see this often in my work, where a number of board members are close friends and can become sort of cliquish or can dominate decisions. So, to the extent that you can, in Bell County, where there's 1 degree of separation, bring on people who are maybe not as closely connected. That's always helpful. They know each other, they have good relationships, but they're not their best friend, they're not their brother or sister, right? You can look to local leadership programs. All of the communities in Bell County, Leadership Temple, Leadership Belton, I'm sure Colleen has a leadership program, local colleges and universities. And you can post your positions publicly on your website, on your social media. But the key is you want to get beyond your network because in almost every organization I've worked with that has had an open board recruitment process, they have found board members who they never would have found otherwise by getting beyond their network. And as you're building your board, you want to prioritize diversity and inclusion. And that's not because it's the right thing to do, although it is, but it's because boards can't function effectively if they're homogenous. The boards need to represent multiple perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences in order to think creatively, um, to make good decisions. And diverse boards also have diverse networks. If everybody on the board has the same friends, has the same connections, works at the same place, goes to the same church, lives in the same community, you are not, they're all going to have the same network, right? You're going to be tapping into the same people over and over and over again rather than reaching new stakeholders who could invest in your organization. So when you're thinking about diversity, you're prioritizing diversity, you want to think about race, age, gender, geography, where they're located. You want to think about socioeconomic status. Clearly, you want to have folks on your board who have connections to financial resources, but you also want to have people who are more closely related to the populations that you serve, in order to make sure that you have that representative voice. A good way to do that is to utilize a board composition matrix. This is one that I have adapted and used with multiple organizations. I've adapted it from Board Source, um, where you're looking and saying, okay, let's look at who's on our board currently. What's their demographic composition? What skills and abilities do they bring? What connections? What areas of expertise or knowledge do they bring? Um, and then you can see very clearly where there are gaps in your matrix. If you look here in this example, there's nobody with legal experience on this board. And you can customize this because the areas of expertise for your organization may be different than others. You may not need anybody with affordable housing, as is on this one, for example, right? So you want to use something like this to see who's already on your board, and then you can go about your recruitment process accordingly, looking to fill those gaps. Um, just a quick note on this, if you do use a board composition matrix, I like to do this as a Google document or another shared type of document so that board members can fill this out themselves, because you don't want to make any assumptions about your board members, not just because making assumptions about their demographics is problematic, but you really don't know what connections your board members have. And they actually may surprise you when you get this board matrix back and say, oh, I didn't realize that this person had, expertise in fundraising or governance. Let's put them on the governance committee. And before you recruit, you want to have a board job description. And this should look like a staff job description. And then you can use that to create your board member posting, your board posting. So, like, I have the Jaybird Learning Academy right here. I'm working with them right now to recruit their founding board of directors. And in this, you want to include a position summary, Again, just like you would for a staff position. Organizational history, you want to make sure that they understand what their board member responsibilities and expectations are, and if there are any qualifications for membership. Typical qualification for membership would be age restrictions, as well as living or working in the community. Um, you certainly, if you're a community-based organization, want members of the community on your board. So you want to make sure if there are restrictions that those are listed. And you'll use your job description as your basis for building that board member commitment. So you've listed out the responsibilities, you've listed the expectations. So when board members come on and they sign their board member commitment, they know exactly what they are agreeing to. And that's very important. Equally important is the board orientation. Um, this is an annual meeting. I'd like to not do something just for new board members, although you can, especially in larger organizations, do something that's just for brand new board members to come in and learn about the organization, tour your facilities if you have facilities. Um, but an annual meeting to orient and reorient existing board members. So just taking the time, maybe it's the first board meeting of the fiscal year, or maybe it's the last board meeting of the fiscal year, and you invite those new board members who are incoming board members to that meeting, and you use that time to go over programs, but to also go over expectations, to go over what we do, to go over your impact, what to expect. You want to maintain an updated board packet with your bylaws, board expectations. If you have a pledge form, your board contact list, maybe a list of your programs, your staff, your articles of incorporation, a copy of your most recent strategic plan, and really any other relevant documents that are going to help that board member to govern the organization effectively. It used to be we would always put these in a paper binder. Now most organizations do a Dropbox or a Google Drive where all board documents are stored. There is also board software, Boardable. There's a couple other Board Effect that you can actually use as kind of a management tool where you're uploading documents and using it for board attendance, which is something you can consider, if you have a larger organization. You want to check in regularly with new board members and even consider maybe a mentor-mentee agreement. I find this especially with really large boards that new board members tend to kind of get lost. And they can also be sort of nervous to ask questions during the board meeting. So having somebody that they can go to ask those questions without feeling, vulnerable can be really helpful. And then again, as I mentioned, all board members, typically at this annual meeting or annual retreat, should sign a board agreement. And it's not just when you come on the board, you sign the board agreement. Every year, you're renewing that commitment to the organization. You're saying, hey, I understand what's expected of me. So lastly, beyond recruitment, we really want to think about board revitalization. We have a board building cycle. It's not just, hey, you come on and then you serve as a board member and you roll off. There's a process, and when we're identifying those board members, we're cultivating them, we're sharing, much like the donor cultivation cycle, right? We're sharing the mission, we're sharing why you should want to be involved. We're recruiting them. Again, we're orienting them throughout their entire board service. We're both engaging them in programs and services and governance. We're educating them on the organization, on the sector, on how to be a good board member. And then we're rotating, right? Because you don't want to be stagnant. You want to employ term limits, and we'll talk about term limits later on in the presentation, so that you're rotating members off the board and bringing on new perspectives. You want to evaluate how your board building process is going, and you want to celebrate those board members who are rolling off. So I have this quote, this is from a board source publication, that exceptional boards energize themselves through planned turnover, thoughtful recruitment and inclusiveness. We've talked about thoughtful recruitment and inclusiveness a little bit. What I mean by planned turnover is understanding when board members are going to roll off the board and making sure you have board members to replace them who have similar skills so that you're not losing, valuable skill sets when board members roll off. That you're thinking about the officer positions and how those officer positions are going to turn over and making sure you have a strong succession plan, for example, for your vice chair to move into the chair role. Next is ensuring legal and ethical integrity. We've talked about this, the fiduciary responsibilities. Again, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. When we talk about legal and ethical integrity, we need to talk about conflict of interest. Anytime that their personal interests could compromise their objective judgment, you have a conflict of interest. And even the appearance of that can harm the public trust. Um, we're seeing that in a lot of public spaces right now, where one person is connected to something, but they're connected to something else that's problematic. So understanding where there may be perceived conflict of interest is also very important. That's one of your duties as a board member. We talked a little bit about this again in the Mission Ready session last month, but the organization, this is private inurement, right? The IRS has this clause saying that the organization must not be organized or operated for the benefit of private interests, and that no 501c3's earnings may benefit any private shareholder or individual. So if there's any perception that somebody might be financially benefiting on your board of directors from their participation on that board, that's going to raise some red flags. So when we talk about avoiding conflicts, you want to make sure you have a very strong conflict of interest policy that covers all personal interests, not just your financial interests. You want to require board members to disclose any potential interests, whether those are real or perceived, right, before a decision is made. And the interested board member, or those that might be impacted by a potential decision, should recuse themselves before the discussion and voting. So a good example, right? There are a limited number of construction companies. Maybe you're going through a capital campaign, you're going to build a building, you're deciding on your contractor, and somebody on the board has ties to a construction company. They need to recuse themselves from the discussion and voting, and you need to make sure that the meeting minutes are reflective of that disclosed conflict and the fact that that board member abstained. So that if anything comes up in the future and you're audited, again, the IRS looks at your minutes. They want to see, okay, that person did abstain. That is reflected in the minutes. So a couple of best practices with regard to your financial or your legal and ethical integrity is to have strong policies and bylaws. Have a standing committee with responsibility for board governance. In organizations with larger boards, you'll have a specific governance committee. And that governance committee is going to be responsible for reviewing the bylaws, for creating policies, for reviewing policies regularly, for the board nomination process, board recruitment process, and for making sure that board members are adhering to their expected to what they're expected to do. You want to ensure that you have at least these policies. We already talked about financial or risk management and conflict of interest. Other policies that are very common are whistleblower policy, just making sure that, hey, if there are red flags, there's a way to deal with it. Document retention and destruction, especially if you are working directly with clients. This is very important. Client information, how you're going to keep that safe, how you're going to dispose of it, as well as, and not everybody has this, but it's very, very good to have a gift acceptance policy. Are you going to, so just to use a very relevant and timely example, right? If Rowan or Meta comes to you, right, with a huge check, is your organization going to accept that? So maybe you want to specify if there are donations you don't want to take, if there's a policy for taking that. You also want to talk about in your gift acceptance policy how you acknowledge your donors. Um, Best practice again, review your bylaws every 2 to 3 years. That's just generally speaking. No matter how recently you've had a change, if nothing else has happened, just look at them every 2 to 3 years and see if they need to be revised at all. They may or may not be. But if you have growth or expansion, if there are new laws passed, if you have big operational shifts, for example, if you're an all volunteer board and now you have an executive director, you need to change your bylaws because it needs to say the board has the authority to hire and set compensation for an executive director if it does not say that, right? So there are there are events that may trigger review more recent than every 2 to 3 years. And then lastly, board's role in enhancing the organization's public standing. Um, Basically, you want to be an ambassador for the organization. This is a really important role. Um, to be that ambassador, to know the mission, to practice your elevator pitch, to be able to speak knowledgeably about the organization in public. Um, you board participation, again, enhancing public standing. You might have the board participate in public relations in some form or fashion. Oftentimes, if you have an executive director, they're the face of the organization. But if you have well-connected board members, or your board chair, other leaders might be asked to speak to the press on behalf of the organization, to speak at community events, maybe to go around if they have time or they have those connections to the Lions Club or the Rotary and talk about what your organization is doing and leveraging their community connections. Other things you might consider having a marketing or a public relations committee that's comprised of board members, particularly if you don't have that capacity on staff. You want to make sure your board members are participating in special events, that you're maintaining that culture of transparency. And what I mean by that is making sure that there's no perceived conflict of interest. If your financial best practice is to have your 990 posted on your website, anything that's going to make anything that you can do as an organization to be more transparent so that donors and funders and the community know that you are a stand-up organization. And your board needs to steward your donor and community resources appropriately. If you've gotten a large gift, those donors, those funders need to know that you're going to make good use of those gifts. So one of the things the board can do to enhance public standing is make sure that you're communicating often about the impact of your programs and services. You're talking with the media, you're sending a newsletter to your networks, whatever that looks like. Folks need to know that you're stewarding those resources appropriately. So those are the 10 responsibilities. I want to highlight a couple of different things from BoardSource Essential Governance Practices. These are the things that BoardSource says, hey, these are absolute must-dos for every board. This is essential. Attending meetings, having term limits. We haven't talked very much about that yet, so we're going to talk about that in a minute. Being strategic with your recruitment, strategic planning, approving the budget, having that CEO job description and doing the evaluation, and then performing that annual audit. So briefly, a little bit about term limits, especially for some of you who are with newer organizations who may not have terms or term limits in place yet. Term limits are really a way to make sure that you have board turnover. You're bringing new people in, you're bringing new perspective that allows your board to be more diverse. It prevents, by bringing in new perspectives and having those term limits where people cycle off the board, it really prevents any one member or group of members from dominating decision making or discussion. We've mentioned having a group of friends can be detrimental on a board because you engage in that group think. if you have a board that's not serving you, you need to make sure that you have ways to get those problematic board members off your board. So having term limits prevents those long-serving board members also from being fatigued or complacent in their roles. You see this often where somebody served on a board for a long time, and maybe when they started their board service, they were super engaged. They were showing up to every meeting. They were participating. They were leveraging their networks. And now, they've been on the board for 4 or 5 years. They've joined another board, and that has more of their attention. Having term limits allows you to replace those board members on a cycle and bring in that fresh perspective and those who will be more energized about the organization. So leading practice in term limits is to limit board members to 2 consecutive 3-year terms or 6 years total. That second term should not be automatic. After 3 years, the board chair or the executive director should talk to each board member whose first term is up and say, hey, your term's coming up. Are you in a place where you can recommit to the organization? And do you want to serve a second term? And if they do, then the board needs to vote on the board member to serve that second term. So your second term should not be automatic. You can serve up to 2 consecutive terms, but you still have to go through the same process of having the board vote for you to serve that term. You want to stagger your terms to ensure that not all your board members are rotating off at the same time. Rule of thumb, maybe a third of your board is rotating off per year, depending on how large your board is, and you're bringing on new board members. And you definitely want to implement at least a mandatory 1-year sabbatical after the second term, so to allow those board members to maybe rejoin later. You don't want to say, hey, you've done your 2 terms and you can never serve again, but you also don't want them to be able to come back right away. Oftentimes when you have that mandatory 1-year sabbatical, folks don't take you up on coming back up to the board, but maybe 5 or 10 years later they will, So you just want to make sure that they have the option to come back. And also that once they do roll off the board, that you are continuing to engage them, right, through committees and other ways of engaging board members. And you want to make sure that your term limits are clearly defined in your bylaws. A few additional leading governance practices we're going to talk about here, just some meeting tools, consent agendas, board evaluation. We talked a little bit about board member agreements, and we're going to talk about committees. So in a traditional meeting, oftentimes you'll see this agenda on the side, right? You're welcoming, you're approving your meeting minutes, the executive director is reporting out, you're getting your financial report, and the board is voting to approve the financials. And then you might have some oral reports from your various committee chairs. Hey, here's what our committee is working on. You're going to vote on old business. You're going to talk about and potentially vote on new business, and then you're going to adjourn. That's your meeting. To be a little more strategic and have meetings that lend themselves more to better board governance, this is a sample agenda of what you can do. This is called a consent agenda. And in a consent agenda, you will vote on all the things that don't require discussion at that meeting. So typically what you'll include is the previous meeting's minutes. If you have a director's report or committee reports, they will be written. You'll ask the committee in advance, hey, can you just give me a short blurb, what your committee is working on, anything you need the board to know. And any organizational dashboards that you have, right? This is how many clients we've served. This is, anything that we have to report in that space, comparative revenue report, anything that can be looked at, reviewed in advance that doesn't require discussion. You're going to vote on that, and then you can actually move into your fiduciary business, which would include the financial review, and again, should have the key takeaways. You might include even in your consent agenda, you might include your profit and loss statement and your balance sheet. But if there are key takeaways, you want to make sure that you're actually discussing them within the meeting. And then any new or old business with required discussion. Then once you've done that, because you've shortened all that meeting time from reporting out, then you have time to have more strategic discussion or to spend time with your board having some continuing education, right? Like, here's what you need to know about our sector, our mission, the people we serve, about our governance. You can use that time more strategically. So using a consent agenda, having a mission connection kind of at the top of the agenda, whether that's just sharing a client story, or when you can even have a staff member come in and share something that they can about a client story, or even having a client or somebody who's been impacted by your mission to come in and share their story. And then lastly, you want to go into executive session. Executive session just basically means that the board is meeting without the executive director or chief executive. And the reason for doing that is that not all discussion requires the executive to be in attendance. There are some times that the board, as the highest level of authority for the organization, needs to have strategic discussions that don't involve the executive director, particularly when you're talking about the director's performance, when you're talking about salary increases, when you may be talking about a recent staff issue or some decision that you're kind of second guessing, right? So there may be times that you need to talk without the executive director present. If you are only going into executive session once a year, when it's time to evaluate the executive director, then when there is an issue, right, and you need to go into executive session, that's a big red flag for the executive director. That's scary. That makes them vulnerable. By going into executive session every meeting, you're sort of normalizing that process. And then when you do have to go into executive session, it's no big deal, right? It's just part of your regular process. And it's something you should do. It builds respect and trust among board members to be able to have that peer-to-peer conversation. Board self-assessment. Again, the board should assess itself every 2 to 3 years. There are free tools you can use. Board Source uses a self-assessment tool that is a paid tool. That's a survey. It takes about 45 minutes. Each board member, every single board member, completes it. And it has all kinds of questions around the people, the culture of the organization, the work of the organization's impact. It asks a lot of really specific questions so that you can get scores in each category. And this is really helpful, particularly for more mature organizations. I would not recommend going through this paid self-assessment for newer organizations. As many of you know, and I've worked with you in this capacity, I do have a much more truncated organizational assessment that only involves the executive director and the board chair. But this is really something that's more of a 360 evaluation. And what's unique about the Board Source tool is that it benchmarks all of your scores against national scores, because Board Source has done this, all over the country, and they have more than 4,000 responses to draw from. So you're looking at how your organization compares to the scores of other organizations. And why that's important is if you're not, just like with the executive director evaluation, if you're not assessing your performance annually as a board, you don't know where you need to improve. We talked a little bit about a board member commitment. This is a clear set of expectations that every board member signs. It's going to say, hey, I'm going to attend meetings. I'm going to commit to serving on a committee. I'm going to make a financial contribution, and I understand my fiduciary responsibilities. So you're signing it annually. It can be a manual signature. You can do it online. You might even write it as a contract, outlining the duties of the organization to the board members, right? So like, here's what you're going to do for us. Here's what you're going to do for the organization. all of these things. And here's what we are committing. We're committing to providing the materials in advance. We're committing to keeping you informed as a board. We're committing to XYZ, right? So you can write it as a contract. And you might also include in your board member commitment just a thing that says, hey, I acknowledge that I've received the bylaws and policies, just so you have that on record. Excuse me. Just as an example, this is from Family Promise National. Like, this is their board agreement. I'm going to attend 75%. I'm going to avoid political campaigns, make a contribution. I'll be loyal. I'll comply with all these policies. See, whistleblower, conflict of interest. And I'll sit on a committee and actively participate in its work. It is important to have an annual board retreat of some sort. I facilitate retreats, but your retreat doesn't have to be facilitated. It could be something that you're just doing as a board to connect to your mission, your purpose, your values, to align on those roles and expectations, to set your goals for the coming year. And really, because this is not a regular board meeting and you're getting out of that space, I actually always recommend that boards do their retreat in the space that they don't regularly meet. It not only encourages that fellowship, but it gets folks thinking a little more creatively when they have this opportunity to meet together outside of the structure of a regular board meeting. So annual retreats are really important. I would recommend you don't skimp on them, and then you engage in that actual strategic planning process every 3 years. The last thing I'll say about good governance, I have a couple slides on this though, is about using your committees effectively. You want to employ a mix of standing and ad hoc committees. Your standing committees are the ones that always meet regularly. They have assigned membership. Your ad hoc committees are more of task forces. They come and go. They're not written into your bylaws. They just, you might have, a building selection committee if you're selecting a facility, or a human resources committee if you have to update your human resources policies. That committee works, it disbands. All committees, regardless of whether they are standing or ad hoc, should have a description or an up-to-date charter. They need to be led by a chair that has the relevant skills and knowledge to lead that committee, and have an established meeting schedule so that folks know when to show up, how to participate. You want to make sure your committee chairs know what they're supposed to do, right? What does it mean to lead a committee? What are you asking your committee to do? How do you assign responsibilities effectively? Your committees should be carrying out, supporting, and informing the work of the board, not replacing the board, right? You're doing the work, you're in the board meeting, you have a discussion, it gets referred to the appropriate committee, it comes back, the committee gives their report, you're able to vote on any items that are needed, that need board vote. And we talked a little bit about how those committees can include both board and community members and provide those on and off ramps for board leadership. So a couple of recommended standing committees. I always say all boards should have finance, resource, and governance if you only have 3 committees. If you are a smaller board and you don't have enough, members to make up all 3 committees, governance can be achieved by your executive committee or another committee, but you really do have to assign somebody the task of governance, or it's going to get overlooked. Those bylaw reviews, the policies. And I would say that's the same for anything that you do. Having an assigned committee that is responsible for it is going to make sure it gets done. Depending on the size of your board and who is on your board, you might consider additional standing committees, maybe marketing and communication, events, if you have a very event-heavy organization, program evaluation or a curriculum committee. And again, some of those task forces that I mentioned. I am on an executive search committee right now. If you're going through a comprehensive strategic planning process, you might have a strategic planning committee that's comprised of a subset of your board. Your governance committee, as I mentioned, is going to review your bylaws, policies, and structures. They're responsible for recruitment, orientation, and succession planning, as well as board training and development. So you want to promote, again, that continuous learning among your board members. And the governance committee is going to look at that. And they're going to look at your board's performance, both as a collective, how are we working as a board together, as well as individual member participation. Are our members fulfilling the responsibilities that they committed to when they did their board performance or when they did their board member agreement? And that's all I have for y'all today. So, do we have any questions? We have, I think, about 20 minutes allotted for Q&A.
Yeah, that's true.
And anybody just feel free, you can pop any questions in the chat or you can come off mute and just ask them directly.
Emily, how do we access the slides, so to speak?
So they will be on the Rock Rose website. Solange, if you want to put that in the chat, already there are slides from previous presentations that are available, I believe, on the events tab on the Rock Rose website, and this will probably be uploaded within the next few days.
Okay,
Ye-
great.
Yes. Well, I can also ask Kelsey to send them out to everyone who attended.
Perfect. Any other questions about the content or
Very
anything?
comprehensive. I
Thank you.
appreciate all that information.
Anybody else? I know it's late.
Thank you for everything you shared. It was eye-opening.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, great job, Emily. It just reminded me of our conversation, Christina. It's Christina.
Thanks, Christina. All right. Well, if anybody has any questions at all, I'm going to go ahead. I'm putting my email address in the chat, and I am always available for any questions that you have. And again, this will be available on the Rock Rose website within the next few days. So thank you all for coming, and I hope that you learned something.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you, everybody. And thank you, Emily, for sharing all of this information with everybody. We appreciate you being here and being willing to do that tonight.
Of course. All right, everybody. Y'all have a great evening.
Likewise. Bye-bye.